First of all, my profound thanks to Stephen Pink, Julie Dresfina, Anthony Lappin, and the other organizers of this conference, to the Society for the Study of Medieval Languages and Literature, the Oxford Research Center in the Humanities, and to the many people who go unnamed in conference programs, but actually make the thing work. As a septuagenarian scholar addressing a conference session on the future of scholarship, I feel something of the diffidence that one hopes a septuagenarian politician feels when addressing a constituency, most of whose concerns have been formed by issues and experiences much more recent than those that were crucial, although still often unresolved, when he was their age. What I hope to be here is more of a Bernie Sanders than a Joe Biden, and not, God forbid, a Donald Trump. What I wish to do here today is to describe a few textual situations and to make a number of observations on them to point out problems and possibilities that they present for future development of electronic text. As a textual critic, working on or producing critical editions of medieval Latin and Middle English texts, the Cartae of the annual general chapter of the Carthusian order through the 15th century, the chastising of God's children, Nicholas Love's Mirror of the Blessed Life of Jesus Christ, Walter Hilton's Scale of Perfection in both English and Latin, and Marguerite Porret's Mirror de Simples Âmes Anéanties in various languages, I have worked, as I was trained, with pencil and paper or pencil and typescript, collating text for print publication. I first encountered electronic text production, a word processor, when I was nearly 40 years old. My experience lies almost entirely in the world of two-dimensional copy. But I hope that this has freed my imagination to visualize what the aspects of textual study with which I am most familiar might look like if we were to picture them beyond the two-dimensional plane in cyberspace. I've seen a variety of applications of electronic media to aspects of textual studies, but they have all seemed to me still to be locked into the two-dimensional. They present themselves on a flat screen, almost as if they were printed on paper. Elements of the presentation may be movable within the flat screen, but it is still always a flat screen. What I would like to do here today is to project what some aspects of textual research might look like if they were imagined otherwise. In his sprawl trilogy of novels, William Gibson invented the word cyberspace, a consensual hallucination, a graphic representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system. Unthinkable complexity, lines of light ranged in the non-space of the mind and constellation of data. In this space, in the novels, various government and corporate entities, all heavily defended, float like multicolored cubes and pyramids. A limited presentation. In the outside near future world from which the cyber jockeys or cowboys jack into cyberspace, an important component of the architectural landscape comprises the arcologies, in which the characters live and work. Imagined by the Italian-American architect Paolo Soleri, arcologies are intended to be self-contained, economically self-sufficient, densely populated, ecologically low-impact human habitats. What intrigues me is the possibility of combining these two concepts from Gibson's novels, importing the arcologies into cyberspace to envisage structures of information amongst which the reader can navigate, unfolding them at will into three-dimensional presentations, linking text to text, manuscript to manuscript, scribe to scribe, limner to limner, dialectal profile to dialectal profile, provenance and ownership to provenance and ownership. What interests me here is the way that the migration of information technology to a new medium enables changes in the way that the information itself is conceptualized. The shift from two-dimensional print to three-dimensional electronic presentation of information is as momentous in its consequences as the shift from manuscript to print. For example, Let us look at the way the concept of textual authority changed with the invention of the printing press. In 1509, the Carthusian order, the strictest of the Western Christian monastic orders, promulgated a complete new edition of the historical rules of the order. This impressive collection of documents had been compiled at the annual general chapter over several years. The oldest Carthusian houses were told to bring their oldest manuscript copies to the chapter for examination and collation. The final, fully corrected version was scrutinized and approved by 3 successive chapters before being handed over to the printer Johannes Amerbach of Basel. 2 letters appended on the last pages of the volume specify that under the strongest discipline of removal from office and expulsion from the order, no official or member of the order is ever again to arrange for the printing of these materials. By these measures, excuse me, the authorities of the Carthusian order, the definitores, the priors meeting in chapter with the Reverend Father, exerted their control over the production of a uniform, authentic, authorized text. In 1517, the Grande Chartreuse commissioned a printing of a missal, according to the use of the order, corrected and amended by Jean Barchois, the official scribe of the chapter. An antiphonal and psalter of Carthusian use followed in the next 2 years. For more than a century, it has been noted that the Carthusian order turned early to the use of print as a favored medium for the production of books. What I wish to draw attention to here is the fact that the new medium of print provided a hitherto impossible degree of uniformity and authority to text, not just to the Carthusians, but to anyone who wished to avail themselves of it. The exploitation of a new medium opened up the possibility for a new conceptualization of textuality. Uniform, authorized text, desired but impossible to achieve in the classical world, barely within reach in the later medieval period for the stationers of the University of Paris, for example, has become our seldom questioned default mode, protected by copyright and the conventions of editorial apparatus, introductions, textual and explanatory notes, and so on. It is what I assume, for example, when I assign texts for my undergraduate classes. This does not mean that even modern texts are uniform, even when they can claim to be authorial. But we think of non-uniform printings of modern texts as anomalies. For texts originally transmitted in manuscript, however, what we think of as anomalous is the norm. The natural state of text, I argue, is variation. And the intervention of print has obscured that fact for the past 4.5 centuries. During the modern period, scholarship has invented a succession of methodologies for the production of authorized pre-modern as well as modern text, from the Renaissance search for older pre-Gothic and thus arguably more reliable copies of classical Latin texts, to the development of recension, most strongly associated with the name of Karl Lachmann, to Joseph Bédier's repudiation of recension and turn to best text editing, to George Kane, Talbot Donaldson, and George Russell's demolition of recension and espousal of conjectural emendation as the way of genius in the Athlone edition of Piers Plowman. For the most part, in such modern editions, the reporting of variant readings of the manuscripts in the critical apparatus serves the purpose of providing evidence for the argument, which is the text as reconstructed by the editor. More recently, Paul Zumthor and Bernard Cerquilini have popularized the terms mouvance and variance to recuperate the status of the variety of readings surviving in the many copies of medieval texts. The one weakness that I find in both of their arguments is that they seem to feel the need to find a reason for variation outside of textuality itself, in the anonymous nature of medieval oral performance and scribal practice. I would repeat rather that variation is the normal state of text. which is only artificially and partially at best inhibited by the authority imposed by print. An alternative form of presentation of text that preserves its mouvance, its variance, is the multiple edition of various instantiations of a text. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the Early English Text Society and the Chaucer Society produced parallel text editions of a number of works of artistic, historical, or philological importance, including the Canterbury Tales, Piers Plowman, and Cursor Mundi. Two recent representations of this tradition are A.V.C. Schmidt's four-text edition of Piers Plowman and the ongoing EETS edition of Walter Hilton's Scale of Perfection that presents two manuscript versions of the text in face-to-face format with a critical apparatus that includes all variant readings of all manuscripts. This represents, I should think, the practical limit of printed textual presentation. Although the ledger book format of some of the early Chaucer Society and EETS multiple text editions did in fact offer the reader even more, provided they were interested in the democratic view of scholarship espoused by the founders of EETS in being their own amateur textual critics. Two important texts occurring in England in multiform copies in English, French, and Latin, Mandeville's Travels and Untitled, were produced by EETS in series of editions of single manuscripts. The culmination of the edition of Untitled was reached in Bella Millett's corrected edition of the text in Cambridge Corpus Christi College Manuscript 402. Millett was also interested in the possibility of electronic edition and published a number of single text editions of Middle English poems and translations drawn mainly from the British Library Manuscript Harley 2253 anthology, with present-day English translations on the Wessex Parallel Webtext site. In an important article that asked whatever happened to electronic editing, Millett begins by noting that Tim Berners-Lee's initial proposal for what would become the World Wide Web was produced in the same year as the publication of Cercolini's Eloge de la Variante. She continues by noting three apparently insurmountable problems that limit electronic editorial projects: technology, impact, and sustainability, and ends by describing makers of electronic editions in terms borrowed from Matthew Arnold's stanzas from the Grande Chartreuse, wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. Millett describes two major electronic editing projects in Middle English: the Scholarly Digital Editions Canterbury Tales project and the Common Electronic Archive. Both projects began with the aim of producing editions on CD-ROM, but both have since migrated to other media. Scholarly Digital Editions, an enterprise run by Peter Robinson together with Barbara Borleo, have published a series of texts beginning with Estelle Stubbs' 2000 digital facsimile of the Hengert manuscript, Aberystwyth, National Library of Wales, Penarth manuscript D392D, and including several of Chaucer's tales edited by means of collate software, which uses cladistic analysis to classify the affiliations of the various manuscripts of the text in a biological simulation of recension. Recently, however, SDE has published an app edition of the general prologue of the tales, featuring an edition of the text accompanied by an online facsimile of the Hengert manuscript and a minimal translation by Terry Jones, with glossary and notes. The facsimile is presented in full page format and is also set in single-line text boxes side by side with the edited text. The home page of the app requests volunteers for a crowdsourced transcription of all manuscripts of the complete Canterbury Tales, estimated to amount to some 30,000 pages. The fact that Chaucer's works are available electronically through Oxford Scholarly Editions Online should also be mentioned. At present, the edition of Chaucer's works available in the series is that of W. W. Skeat, originally published in 1894. A new edition produced specifically for OSEO by Christopher Cannon and James Simpson will present a slightly revised version of Skeat's text, uncontaminated, it would seem, by consultation of the manuscripts. Farlack Turville Peter has described the advantages that Piers Plowman Electronic Archive offers over a print edition, noting particularly the advantage of full transcripts of the manuscripts over citation of variants in a critical apparatus, as well as digital facsimiles and transcriptions of background material, including sources, analogs, and contemporary responses. Arguing against Kane and Donaldson that the form of the B text of Piers from which all surviving manuscripts and prints descend can be reasonably recovered from their patterns of agreement. This is Robert Adams' Semma of the manuscripts of the B text. John Burrow and Turville Peter have produced a print edition of this form of the text. This version of the text, together with the editions of 8 of the 15 manuscripts of the B text, are now available open access from the Piers Plowman Electronic Archive. The editions offer scribal, diplomatic, and critical editions, critical versions of the text, including what are often thought of as textual incidentals, such as titles, capitals, and marginalia, with notes and digital facsimiles of the manuscripts linked to the text, and an option to download the XML markup that underlies the presentation of the text on the page, and an introductory paleographic codicological description of the manuscript. All of these magnificently detailed editions produced with sedulous attention to accuracy constitute separate files. Some comparison is made in textual notes to variant readings, but each is essentially an edition of a single manuscript of the text. Something of what can be done using digital technology to demonstrate the multiple linkages of manuscripts and texts of medieval English literature beyond the discussion of textual affiliation can be seen in the recent work of Angela Bennett, who has produced a series of interactive maps of the co-occurrence of Piers Plowman in the surviving manuscripts, with some 80 other works in English, Latin, and French, themselves occurring in hundreds of manuscripts. This is one of several interactive maps that Bennett has produced. Through the mid-20th century, discussion of the dialect of Middle English text tended to relatively cursory description of the majority of the manuscripts of a given text, with, in more philologically oriented editions, far more thorough discussion of the linguistic features of the base text of an edition or the probable dialect of the author. In the 1960s, however, Angus McIntosh and Michael Samuels began the project to create the Linguistic Atlas of Later Middle English, beginning with a survey of variant forms similar to those used by students of present-day English dialectal analysis. A survey that was applied in the first instance to manuscripts that could be located specifically and expanded to other manuscripts that shared distinguishing linguistic features with these, with the intention of creating a self-consistent network of scribal dialectal location. Laumi has generated a good deal of skepticism, in large part because of the tendency to certitude among creators and early users of Laumi, combined with inaccurately generalized characterizations that need far closer examination. And because Laumi does not localize scribal dialects in the actual geography of England, but in a notional geography of dialectal variation that often places the medieval scribe in the middle of a cultivated field in present-day England, or in a pond, or some other inaccessible place. This is a map of the scribal dialectal localization of manuscripts of the scale of perfection, produced for A.J. Bliss in 1963. Laumi is certainly in need of further refinement. The network needs tightening up. But it does have the advantage in terms of the graphic presentation of information that it allows the creation of maps of distribution of at least the dialectal profiles of the scribes who copy the work. Several more recent projects have applied the approaches and questionnaire developed for Allow-Me in further studies of particular texts, drawing conclusions that have wide significance in how we envision the circulation of major works of late medieval English literature. Working on the AHRC-funded Geographies of Orthodoxy project at Queen's University Belfast and St. Andrews, Scotland, Ryan Perry produced a series of maps of the dialectal location of the manuscripts of Nicholas Love's Mirror of the Blessed Life of Jesus Christ. Jacob Thijssen applied the Allow-Me dialectal questionnaire to the complete corpus of text of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in 9 early manuscripts using data available through the Canterbury Tales project. His conclusions illustrate possible changes of exemplar within the manuscripts and argue that the text did not circulate piecemeal, but that large tranches of the text were physically together in a fixed order already when it reached the early scribes. Michael Johnston has recently published a study comparing 166 Allow-Me scribal dialectal localizations in 105 manuscripts of the Prick of Conscience, with their provenance, if known, or earliest known ownership. He discovered that in the case of multiple scribes working together on a single manuscript, 71 manuscripts were written in hands from the same county, 48 from adjacent counties, and 30 from the same region. Of the 63 for which provenance is also known, 17 were in the same county as the scribal dialectal profile, 14 in contiguous counties, and only 8 show disparity between scribal dialectal localization and provenance. This evidence leads to the conclusion that owners of manuscripts of the Prick of Conscience, at least, did not send to regional or national centers of book production to obtain copies. The surviving manuscript copies tend to be local work. I've done a trial comparison of manuscripts of Hilton's Scale of Perfection with similar results, and have also produced a visual display of the information, again, a flat map. The colored arrows, by the way, show movement of manuscripts from where they were first copied to either the place where later material was added in another hand or where their first ownership is attested. Another form of information about the manuscripts in which medieval English literature survives is available online through the University of York's AHRC-funded Late Medieval English Scribes project, which boasts 422 manuscript descriptions, 528 scribal graphic profiles, 17,468 images of letter forms, and 451 images of full manuscript pages, searchable by manuscript, scribe, author, and letter form. Coverage tends to be of manuscripts containing works by the usual late Middle English suspects: 114 manuscripts containing works by Chaucer, 56 of Gower, 37 of Hoccleve, 10 of Lydgate, 9 of Trevisa. None of the Middle English Wycliffite Bible versions, of which some 250 manuscripts survive. Piers Plowman, The Prick of Conscience, 123 manuscripts. Richard Rolla, whose English and Latin works survive in more than 400 manuscripts, some 300 written in England. Or Walter Hilton, whose English and Latin works survive in some 80 manuscripts written in English, with a dozen more written on the continent. 2 of the 61 surviving manuscripts of Nicholas Love's Mirror are registered. Both happen to have been written by the scribe of the Petworth Chaucer. A number of print publications catalog, compare, identify, and describe the illumination and illustration of late medieval English manuscripts, particularly in 2 series, one edited by J.G.G. Alexander, the other by Kathleen L. Scott, but this information is not available online. Identifications of scribal hand and limner are occasionally also made in sporadic publications, but their discovery is at this point still fortuitous, again, unless they are among the well-known and often described manuscripts of the late Middle English usual suspects. What I would like to envisage at this point is all of this information available online, and not just available in various relatively incompatible information formats, but linked. It might be objected that this would create an online archive identical to the archive already present in the real world, or worse, something like Borges' Library of Babel. But the solution, it seems to me, lies in the way that the information is linked, so that the reader can follow one strand of information through as many instantiations, texts, manuscripts, scribal hand and dialect, limners, provenance, whatever, as she or he wants, noting connections or disjunctions as he or she goes, and not as a sheaf of separate two-dimensional on-screen images or pages printed off, but as a set of multivalent information structures, arcologies, floating in cyberspace, on which she or he might dock and which he or she might unpack or explore, and then proceed from there. To give an example from textual criticism, the field with which I am most familiar, whether or not guided by the family tree structure of recension, we often envisage the affiliations among the surviving manuscripts and early print copies of a text as a network. Recension, of course, requires that this network have a single root and bifurcating trunk and branches, and that it be done upside down, like a family tree. But the network need not take this form. In fact, although my first edition of Nicholas Love's Mirror used recension as its model, producing a bifid tree representing the 6 primary forms of the text, I have found on closer examination that my textual tree actually should have had 3 branchings, and I made this correction in my second revised edition. But even this did not illustrate clearly the full relationships of the manuscripts. Several copies changed affiliation in different parts of the text. A change of exemplar was actually demonstrable at one point. And 2 presented independent conflations of 2 different forms of the text. This information did not fit on the Semma, so I had to relegate it to a large note at the foot of the page. For the past 15 years, I've been at work completing the critical edition of Walter Hilton's Scale of Perfection, begun decades ago by A.J. Bliss for Book 1 and S.S. Hussey, Book 2. The affiliation of the copies of the text of the scale is even more complex than that of Nicholas Love's Mirror. Scale 1 circulated for some years independently of Scale 2, and a number of manuscripts present either texts that change affiliation or are the result of conflation. In the earliest copies comprising both books, the 2 are in fact written in different hands. I came to the conclusion that a stemma was simply the wrong biological metaphor for the representation of the pattern of affiliation of the text. The pattern was rather rhizomorphic. There are a number of sister stems that all equally represent the original. There is no urtext. This is a hypothetical presentation of the textual affiliations of the surviving originally complete manuscripts and early prints of the 2 books of the scale, based on my analysis of Scale 2 and Bliss's of Scale 1, which is based in large part on previous work by Rosemary Dahlward. The sigla in red designate manuscripts of Scale 1 alone. The 2 in green are manuscripts of the English texts of Scale 2 alone, and those in black designate manuscripts comprising both books. The numerous dashed and dotted lines represent conflation or probable change of exemplar, including change of exemplar between the 2 books. But even this presentation of the textual relations is unclear when seen as it is here in 2 dimensions. For optimal presentation, this rhizomorphic tree should be seen in 3 dimensions. Rhizomes grow that way, mapped onto an ovoid shape, like one end of a rugby football. The line descending from the sigil M at the far left, is the same line as that ascending from the Latin text, lat, at the far right. Now, let us take one step further. Even a two-dimensional tree wrapped around an ovoid shape is still two-dimensional. It lies on the surface of the ovoid. Imagine rather that the sigla connected by dotted or dashed lines to more than one of the group sigla, that is, WS, E, A, H, and AS, NO, and OQ, are actually floating inside the ovoid. Okay, they are all here connected by red lines. Then, subtract the ovoid. It's just a frame, unnecessary to the representation of the textual relations. Then, subtract the lower level of group sigla, N, O, or Q, Z, G, X, or K, a relict of Bliss's and Hussey's original recensionist conceptualization, and you are left with a truly rhizomorphic representation of the textual relation. A network in which some copies were actually made from others. For example, Intertemple Petit Manuscript 524, Sigil P, is actually copied from Lambeth Palace Manuscript 472, Sigil L. But the rest float in relative relation to each other. None of this has been machine generated. I believe that the editor is not, as Derek Pearsall feared, a mere stagehand in this business, but the impresario. She or he is the only one who has read and collated all the manuscripts and assessed their relations. And he or she is also the curator of the other paleographic, dialectal, and codicological connections of the text in each manuscript. This is how I would visualize the electronic critical edition of the future. Each of the sigla here would be a node representing a body of information, a complete edition of the text linked to images of the actual manuscript pages, as in the Piers-Pullman archive, but without the recensionist construction of an ur-text. Instead, each text would be presented both in diplomatic transcript and as the base text of an edition, and the reader should have the option of flipping to another manuscript as base text, which would move him or her to another node in the network and would key the apparatus to that manuscript. The other information, the scribal hands, the illumination and illustration, the dialect maps and provenance, would also have to be linked to each manuscript node in ways that, in fact, I have not been able yet to imagine. I'll leave that to you guys. Each of the texts in each of these manuscripts would also be a node floating in its own network in cyberspace. It is the linkages and the flipping from one text or one aspect of a text in any given manuscript to another that would make such a cybernetic textual archive different from Borges' Library of Babel, with its infinite, apparently beginningless iteration of honeycomb-like cells, each only a step from another on each side or up or down a staircase. The Library of Babel permits no overview, only infinite regression or reiteration. The nodes of information that I envisage, complex as entire self-contained arcologies floating in cyberspace, would indeed encourage complexity and connection.